It is a quiet weekday morning in Minsk, and the boulevards are wide, clean, and almost eerily orderly. Soviet-era apartment blocks lined up in perfect rows, government buildings the size of city blocks. Not a stray piece of litter in sight. To a first-time visitor, it can feel less like a modern European capital and more like stepping directly into a preserved slice of 1975. That impression isn't accidental. In more ways than one, Belarus never fully left the 20th century behind. Most people outside Eastern Europe know exactly one fact about this country, if they know anything at all. It's often called Europe's last dictatorship, ruled continuously by the same man since before a huge share of its current population was even born. That reputation is earned. It's also only one layer of a country with a genuinely deep, frequently tragic, and occasionally surprising history underneath it. Start with the map. Belarus is landlocked, sitting in Eastern Europe between Poland to the west, Lithuania and Latvia to the north, Russia to the east, and Ukraine to the south. A geographic position that has made it, for centuries, a corridor that larger powers march through rather than a country that gets left alone. The terrain is mostly flat lowland, covered in forest, farmland, and an enormous number of lakes and wetlands, earning it the nickname the lungs of Europe in some environmental circles for the sheer scale of woodland, still covering roughly 44% of its territory. The population sits at just over 9 million people, concentrated heavily in Minsk, the capital, which alone holds close to 2 million residents, meaning close to a quarter of the entire country lives in a single city. Belarusian and Russian both hold official status, though in practice Russian dominates daily life, media, and government business far more than Belarusian does. A linguistic imbalance that itself tells you something about how thoroughly this country's identity has been shaped by its much larger eastern neighbor. The country's flat terrain and lack of any major natural defensive barriers is not a small detail. It's arguably the single most important fact about Belarusian geography. With no significant mountain ranges or wide rivers to slow an advancing army, this land has functioned as an open corridor for invading forces moving between Western and Eastern Europe for centuries. From Napoleon's disastrous 1812 campaign against Russia, which crossed directly through Belarusian territory in both directions, to the Nazi invasion of 1941. That vulnerability has shaped Belarusian political culture in ways that outsiders sometimes underestimate. A persistent, deeply rooted preference for stability and strong central authority over the risks of instability, born out of genuine, repeated historical trauma rather than simple passivity. The question was never really whether Belarus exists as a distinct place. It's whether it's ever really been allowed to exist as a fully independent one. Now, the part almost nobody expects. Long before Russia, Poland, or the Soviet Union ever touched this land, the territory of modern Belarus formed the heartland of the medieval Grand Duchy of Lithuania, one of the largest states in Europe at its peak, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Old Belarusian, a direct ancestor of the modern language, served as an official chancery language of that state for centuries, a detail that surprises people who assume Belarusian culture only ever existed in Russia's shadow. When the Grand Duchy later merged with the Kingdom of Poland to form the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Belarusian lands remained part of one of early modern Europe's largest and most religiously diverse states for roughly 2 more centuries. That Commonwealth period left a genuine cultural imprint that still shows up today, particularly in the western regions closest to the Polish border. Catholic communities, Baroque architecture in cities like Grodno, and a historical memory of relative religious tolerance that stood in contrast to the more centralized, religiously uniform empire surrounding it. It's a part of Belarusian history that gets almost no attention outside specialist circles, largely because the centuries that followed worked hard, in different ways, to bury it. That changed at the end of the 18th century, when the Commonwealth was carved up and dissolved through a series of partitions among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, with Belarusian territory absorbed almost entirely into the Russian Empire. Belarusian national identity survived that absorption, but only barely and largely underground. Russification policies actively discouraged the Belarusian language and local culture for well over a century, setting a pattern of larger powers determining Belarus's fate that would repeat itself again and again through the century that followed. Hold on to that timeline. We will get there. Here is a fact that says more about Belarus's 20th century than almost anything else. This country briefly declared independence as the Belarusian People's Republic in 1918, in the chaos following the Russian Revolution. A genuine moment of Belarusian statehood that lasted less than a year before Bolshevik forces absorbed the territory into what would become the Soviet Union. Belarus spent most of the following 7 decades as one of the constituent Soviet republics, and it paid an almost unimaginable price during World War II. Nazi Germany's invasion and occupation devastated the region more severely, proportionally, than almost anywhere else in Europe. Historians estimate roughly a quarter of the entire Belarusian population died during the war, including the near-total destruction of the country's once substantial Jewish community. Minsk itself was reduced to rubble and had to be almost entirely rebuilt from scratch after 1945, which is a large part of why the city today looks so uniformly Soviet. There was barely a pre-war city left standing to preserve. The scale of that wartime destruction is genuinely difficult to convey in numbers alone. Entire villages were burned to the ground along with their inhabitants during Nazi anti-partisan operations. A campaign of destruction so systematic that Belarus lost a larger share of its population than almost any other country involved in the entire war, including nations that suffered heavily elsewhere in Europe. The Katyn Memorial, built decades later near Minsk, commemorates one such village, destroyed along with its residents in 1943, and stands today as a symbol for the hundreds of similar villages across the country that met the same fate. That trauma is still genuinely present in Belarusian national memory. Victory Day, commemorating the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, remains one of the most solemnly and widely observed holidays in the country, treated with a gravity that outsiders sometimes underestimate. Post-war reconstruction transformed Belarus into one of the most heavily industrialized republics in the entire Soviet Union, home to major manufacturing plants producing tractors, trucks, and heavy machinery that are, remarkably, still operating and still exporting products today, decades after the USSR itself ceased to exist. That Soviet industrial backbone is a large part of why Belarus, alone among most former Soviet states, never went through the kind of dramatic post-Soviet economic collapse and privatization chaos that reshaped countries like Russia or Ukraine in the 1990s. The state simply kept running most of the same factories under the same basic model. Yes, this is the part the title promised, and it starts in earnest with the Soviet collapse. Belarus declared independence in 1991 as the USSR dissolved, and in 1994 held its first and, in a meaningful sense, its last genuinely open presidential election, won by a former collective farm director named Alexander Lukashenko. He has held power continuously ever since, through elections that international observers have consistently declined to describe as free or fair, a constitutional referendum in 1996 that dramatically expanded presidential authority, and further constitutional amendments in 2022 that entrenched his position even further. Here is where the armchair daydream becomes a spreadsheet, and where the recent history turns genuinely dramatic. In 2020, following a presidential election widely viewed as fraudulent, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians took to the streets in the largest protests the country had seen since independence, rallying around opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya after her husband, a prominent government critic, was jailed before the vote. For weeks, it looked like something genuinely might change. It didn't. The government responded with mass arrests, documented reports of torture and detention, and a sustained crackdown that forced much of the opposition leadership, including Tikhanovskaya herself, into exile, where she continues to be recognized by many Western governments as the legitimate representative of Belarusian democratic aspirations, rather than Lukashenko's government. The images from that summer genuinely startled outside observers who had barely registered Belarus as a country before. Enormous, largely peaceful crowds filling central Minsk week after week. Women in white dresses forming human chains in a striking, deliberately non-confrontational form of protest, and factory workers, historically a core pillar of the Lukashenko government's support base, walking off the job in solidarity with the demonstrators. For a brief period, it was one of the largest sustained pro-democracy movements anywhere in the world that year. The crackdown that followed was equally sweeping. Tens of thousands detained over the following months, independent media outlets shut down or forced abroad, and a wave of emigration that saw a meaningful share of Belarus's educated, urban professional class leave the country entirely, rather than remain under the tightened political climate that followed. The fallout from 2020 pushed Belarus into an even tighter embrace of Russia than before. Cut off from Western markets and financial institutions following the crackdown, Belarus deepened its economic and military dependence on Moscow, culminating most dramatically in February 2022, when Russian forces used Belarusian territory as a launching point for the invasion of Ukraine. Belarus has since allowed Russia to station nuclear weapons and expand military infrastructure on its soil, formally joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and secured partner status with the BRICS group of nations, each step tying Belarusian sovereignty more tightly to decisions made in Moscow rather than Minsk. But here's the pivot, because the full picture matters more than the headline authoritarianism. Daily life for most Belarusians, on the surface, remains remarkably stable and orderly compared to the chaos affecting some neighboring former Soviet states. Crime rates are low, infrastructure, trains, roads, the Minsk metro, functions efficiently, and basic social services remain reasonably robust by regional standards. This is, in a sense, the trade the Lukashenko government has offered its population for 3 decades. Political control and suppressed dissent in exchange for order, stability, and a paternalistic welfare state that, for a meaningful share of Belarusians, still feels like a reasonable bargain, particularly among older generations who remember the chaos of the 1990s in neighboring countries. If you have made it this far and you are enjoying the journey, a like and a subscribe genuinely help. Let's talk numbers, because the economic picture only makes sense with real figures attached. Belarus's GDP sits at roughly $90 billion nominally, with GDP per capita landing around $10,000, considerably higher, around $35,000, when adjusted for purchasing power. The economy remains heavily industrial by regional standards, built around Soviet-era manufacturing strengths, tractors, trucks, earth-moving equipment, and machine tools, alongside potash mining, where Belarus ranks among the largest global producers of the fertilizer ingredient. Growth has been propped up in recent years largely by Russian military contracts and increased trade with Russia following Western sanctions, a dependency that has left the country's long-term economic prospects looking increasingly narrow compared to its Central European neighbors, several of which have pulled dramatically ahead economically since joining the European Union. Here's a fact that says more about a whole country's ongoing burden than almost anything else. In April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred just across the border in Soviet Ukraine, and yet Belarus absorbed the majority of the radioactive fallout due almost entirely to wind patterns on the days following the explosion. Roughly 23% of Belarusian territory was contaminated to varying degrees, an area larger than some entire European countries, forcing the permanent evacuation of hundreds of villages and towns in the southeastern part of the country. Decades later, a significant exclusion zone remains off-limits to permanent habitation, and Belarus continues to deal with the public health, agricultural, and environmental consequences of a disaster its own reactors had nothing to do with causing. The exclusion zone, unsettling as its origin is, has become an unintentional wildlife sanctuary, with human settlement banned across large stretches of contaminated territory for close to 4 decades now. Wolves, lynx, elk, and other wildlife have moved back into the abandoned villages and fields in numbers rarely seen elsewhere in Europe, turning a genuine human tragedy into one of the continent's strangest de facto nature reserves. Beyond Chernobyl's shadow, Belarus holds one of Europe's most genuinely remarkable natural treasures. Belovezhskaya Puszcha, a vast primeval forest straddling the border with Poland, recognized as one of the last and largest remaining fragments of the old-growth woodland that once covered most of the European lowlands before human settlement cleared it away. The forest is home to the largest surviving population of European bison anywhere on the continent, animals that were hunted to extinction in the wild by the early 20th century and reintroduced here from captive breeding stock, making Belovezhskaya Puszcha the single most important site anywhere in the world for the species' ongoing recovery. The forest carries its own strange footnote in modern political history too. It was inside Belovezhskaya Puszcha, in December 1991 that the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and signed the agreement that formally dissolved the Soviet Union, choosing this remote, ancient woodland as the setting for one of the most consequential political documents of the entire 20th century. Trees that had stood since before Poland and Lithuania first merged into a single commonwealth were, quite literally, standing witness to the end of the empire that had absorbed this land centuries later. No honest account of modern Belarus can skip the harder edges. Freedom of the press, political opposition, and civil society organizations remain tightly restricted, and rights groups continue to document arbitrary detentions of activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens years after the 2020 crackdown formally ended. Belarus's deepening alignment with Russia, including hosting Russian nuclear weapons and supporting the war in Ukraine logistically, has left the country increasingly isolated from the West and increasingly dependent on decisions made well outside its own borders. The order and stability visible on the surface in Minsk coexists with a political system that has, by most independent assessments, left Belarusians with very little genuine say in how their own country is run. If this country is going to pull you in, and access, timing, and current travel advisories are genuinely worth checking carefully before planning any trip. Minsk itself offers a strange, singular kind of appeal for anyone interested in Soviet urban planning, wide ceremonial avenues, monumental architecture, and a rebuilt post-war city that functions almost as a living museum of mid-century Eastern Bloc design. The Brest Fortress, near the Polish border, stands as one of the most significant World War II memorial sites in the former Soviet Union, commemorating the Red Army's desperate early defense against the initial Nazi invasion in 1941. And Belovezhskaya Pushcha remains open to visitors seeking a genuinely rare glimpse of primeval European forest and free-roaming bison, a landscape that has looked, in places, essentially unchanged for over 1,000 years. So here is the mirror. Belarus was the heartland of one of medieval Europe's largest states, was carved up and absorbed by empires that tried to erase its language and identity, lost roughly a quarter of its population in a single war, briefly tasted independence twice in the 20th century, and has spent the 3 decades since its second and lasting independence largely under the control of one man, tied ever more tightly to a much larger neighbor to its east. It's a country that is genuinely orderly and genuinely repressive at the same time, genuinely proud of its deep medieval and wartime history, and genuinely uncertain about how much control it actually holds over its own present, genuinely beautiful in its forests and wildlife even as its politics remain locked in place. Maybe the real question isn't whether Belarus is Europe's last dictatorship. It's how much longer last is going to remain accurate, and what happens to this country the day it finally isn't. If you learned something here, that's what this channel is for. Like the video, drop a comment with what surprised you most, and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives. There's a lot more of the world left to actually understand.